Deservedly, a big part of today's focus in the media and foreign affairs is towards the current war in Ukraine that Putin started a month ago now, even threatening with nuclear warfare. Meanwhile, a wannabe, or should I say already a nuclear power, North Korea that is, keeps on testing its missiles. It was even reported today that they conducted their largest test ever on an intercontinental missile. This was actually this morning happening. Therefore, we think it remains necessary to also stay focused on other countries and regimes that threaten today's world order. North Korea, a country behind closed doors. In the last years, we have heard of executions and labor camps, as well as strict rules about what is and especially what is not allowed within the country's borders. Kim Jong-Un's strategy does seem idiosyncratic at times, bouncing between threats and rapprochement. It makes you wonder how it is possible that Kim Jong-un is still in power. What is Korea or North Korea's geopolitical strategy? What about the historic summit between Trump and Kim in 2018 already? And does Kim Jong-un see space to consolidate or even expand his powers as democratic powers are busy with the conflict near their NATO borders? These questions will be answered today by Professor Remco Breuker. Remco is professor and chair of Korean studies at Leiden University, and in his research he looks beyond the framing of North Korea as our dictatorial enemy. He studies the country's language and history in order to improve our understanding of North Korea, but foremost he studies its people, also those outside of the borders of the North Korean state. And I'm very, very pleased that Remco is here again after a successful prior event. So please, a very warm welcome for Remco Breuker.
Thank you very much for that undeservedly nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to see you here. I have to admit that had I been in your place, I'd probably be sitting outside with a beer. So I applaud your curiosity. I will talk for about 45 minutes. If in the meantime, during my talk, there are questions that you really want to ask at that very moment, please do so. Or if you have criticisms or whatever. I mean, this is a small group, and the distance between me and the people in the row furthest back is manageable. So we can make it interactive if we so desire. If not, if there's any questions after 45 minutes, I'll stop speaking, and it's up to you to ask questions or give comments or whatever you want to discuss here. When I was preparing this presentation, I'd almost finished, and then I looked through an older presentation of a few years back, which is the one you see here. Which doesn't mean I brought the wrong presentation, but I redid the old presentation because it was instructive, at least to me it was instructive to see that some things are still very much the same and other things have changed in quite a dramatic way. We are now in 2022. I don't know how many times North Korea has been prophesied to stop existing, to implode, or to just disappear, or whatever, to not exist anymore. They're still here. North Korea is still here, and there's a good chance that if I would be invited back again in a few years' time to deliver another lecture similar to this, North Korea will still be here. And the time after, perhaps North Korea will still be here. And it is a more important country than we sometimes think. I think in the interest of transparency, tell you that my relationship with the North Korean government is not the best relationship that one can have with the state, especially not with an authoritarian state. So if I come across as biased sometimes, you're completely right, I am biased. That's what threats do. But I try to look beyond North Korea as the archetypical rogue state, because it's a bit more than that. So while I agree that, well, if you would ask me, I think North Koreans would probably do better with a different kind of regime in place. It's up to them. And it would be reductionist to reduce North Korea to just another state that doesn't know how to behave in the international world. So I'll try not to do that, but I am very much critical. A few things before we really start is, I think we should discuss very briefly what we actually know about the DPRK. Is there anything we can know about it? Is it just a dark hole in which information gets sucked in, or actually information doesn't get sucked in, but we don't know what's happening there? Well, it's not the most open country in the world. It can be a scary country, especially if you're North Korean, I would imagine. For us here, it's not the most scary country in the world at all. But there are a few things I think we need to get out of the way before I really start with this lecture. And I noted down some keywords. And this is a fair representation of the questions I usually am asked about North Korea. These are the keywords that will always pop up. Pick up a random newspaper with an article about North Korea, and I imagine most, if not all, of these words will be in the article. Of course, there are different ways of looking at all of these issues. But let's look at them. Dictatorship, isolation, you can't get in or you can't get out. Concentration camps, military threat, missile threat, nuclear threat, crimes against humanity, and perhaps for some time it was thought that the solution to all of these problems would be brought by Donald Trump and Kim Jong-Un. So what I did is I structured my talk around these issues, and we'll look at all of these issues in some depth, and then come to a conclusion. And the conclusion, it was going to be a fairly long conclusion, because that's the part where I'd also like to look at North Korea in today's geopolitical environment. Knowing that it's a risky thing to do because the situation changes all the time, and I will not make any predictions. I'll just try to see where we are, or where North Korea is, with regard to Russia, for example. Okay, let's take that look behind closed doors. A quick word on methodology. North Korea, no, it's not the most transparent, open country in the world. It's not like we can go there tomorrow. Oh, actually, you can. Most of you, depending on your nationality. If you're South Korean or American, you can't. If not, you probably can. It's just a matter of paying a lot of money. At the moment, the corona restrictions, the COVID-19 restrictions are still in force. I don't think they've lifted those, but as soon as those are lifted, you can go there. And apparently, Dutch tourists hold let me rephrase that. The biggest number of tourists, or the how to say this, the largest, I really don't know how to say this, that's embarrassing. If you look at the tourists, and you look at them by nationality, the nationality that travels to North Korea most, in absolute numbers, do you want to guess what nationality that is? Yes, it's a Dutch. Which I knew North Korea was a popular destination for all kinds of reasons. Also in the Netherlands, but it's quite something to actually have in absolute terms, the largest number of visitors to that country. So you can actually go there. Whether it will enlighten you to what's going on there is another matter. I'll not go into that too much here. But it's not the black box we often think it is. The biggest obstacle to knowing North Korean is knowing Korean. If you read Korean at least, you can know much more about North Korea than you would think is possible. North Korea has its own websites, for example. Yes, it's propaganda, but propaganda will still tell you things. If you know Korean, you can actually talk to North Koreans in and outside the country. If they're outside the country, they're either diplomats or businessmen, or of course people who left the country, refugees. And they may be our best way of understanding what's going on in North Korea and how the society actually works. And it's, I've said this before and I'll say this again, but the best way to learn about North Korea is not by talking to me or listening to me, but by talking to an actual North Korean. And there are more of them around than you think. So that's maybe if you're interested as a follow-up, I suggest you do that. In the meantime, there is an academic field which is called North Korean Studies, a part of area studies, and I don't suggest you read this. If you can, well, it's not that small, but it's one of the definitions of area studies. I put it in because it gives me academic legitimacy to put it in. No, but what it comes down to is that it's area studies, which means, to put it very simply and to kind of, well, simplify, if you want to understand something about a different region, a different people, a different culture, and I probably should use the plural there because I know, especially with regard to Asia, outside of Asia, we tend to think of Asia as one whole, with one culture. We tend to think of South Korea as one whole, with one culture. It has different cultures, like any other country, I would say. But in general, you need to know the language. You need to know the cultures, the histories, the context. And you need to be aware, and you need to accept the fact that when you look, there will be people looking back. So if you're lucky, it's a conversation, a dialogue, or more partners would be a conversation. It's never a one-way street. That's what it used to be in the 19th century, and even then it really wasn't, but that's how it was constructed to be. And that's important because with North Korea, often we go, it's like if you want to travel in time, working on North Korea is a very good way because you're back in the 19th century before you know it. It's very Orientalist. We look at North Korea, we explain how things are. Let me ask you a question to illustrate that. You do watch the news, I assume, or in the internet. If somebody explains anything about North Korea, how would you describe that person? Just a general picture of the person who explains about North Korea. What kind of person is that? Not sure whether the question is clear, but what I mean is that usually you see people like me, right? Male, often, North Korea, not always. Not always bearded, but usually professor at some kind of university. Do you ever see a North Korean explaining about North Korea? No. Well, that's a big problem, because most other countries, that's not the case. Yes, you can have an academic explaining something about a particular country, fine. But you also have academics from that country, or regular people from that country, putting it into context, criticizing it, denying it even, or agreeing, or whatever. I mean, all kinds of possibilities there. And that's a big problem with North Korea, that you don't see that happen. In South Korea, it's different, because there are plenty of North Koreans there, about 33,000 refugees. You actually do see them on television, but usually they don't speak English, which makes the transition to other media very difficult. There is a big exception. North Korean, the former vice ambassador to the UK, who defected with his family 5-6 years back, I think. He speaks English, and very well. So he actually does make it to the major international broadcasting outlets. And then you do hear the views of a North Korean, but in general you don't. And that's the biggest problem we have in North Korean studies, I think. People not knowing the language and not being North Korean is not the problem itself, but North Koreans not being represented enough. So that's the context. Let's now go to the issues. Dictatorship. Is North Korea a dictatorship? Well, it'd be hard put to deny that North Korea is a dictatorship. I mean, every country in which elections, in the elections people vote for the one candidate on the ballot in excess of 99% is probably a dictatorship. And I probably don't have to go into much detail here. But it is, the important thing here is what the dictatorship does, how it functions. And this is, I really would like to do a separate lecture on this topic, the evolution of the dictatorship, because North Korea as it is today is very different from the North Korea in the 1950s or 60s. In the 1950s or 60s, North Korea would not have been that very different from any other socialist state, for example, in Europe. Poland, Hungary, it would be very recognizable. Yes, the language and the culture were different, but the system, while not exactly the same, would have been recognizable. Do you know where the grandchildren of the leader of Hungary or Poland in 1965 are today? Does anybody know? Does anybody know the leader of Poland in 1965 or Hungary? No, me neither, so don't worry about that. But the important thing here is when I would ask you to answer the same question about North Korea, you would be able to tell exactly where the grandchildren of this leader are, right? In power in North Korea. And so North Korea somehow morphed from being a socialist country, seriously striving to be a communist country. And they were, generally speaking, very sincere about this. It changed into a totalitarian state, which basically functions like it's a kingdom, ruled by a hereditary family, a dynasty, if you will. Sorry. Now, in this process, the people of North Korea came out worse than they were before, I think. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even in the 1980s, there was a strong sense of ownership, of being able to participate in society, of contributing, and of being heard. North Korea was never a very free country, but until 1970 or so, it was definitely as free or even freer than South Korea, for example. And it wasn't the dictatorship that it is now. But that probably happens when you turn your leaders into hereditary demigods. You can't criticize them anymore. So the dictatorship of North Korea today means that the biggest victims probably are the North Koreans themselves. I'll get to the concentration camps in a minute or so, or in 10 minutes or so, but what you see here are the moments before an execution. Do you know, by the way, why people are executed in North Korea? What the rationale, the reason for this is? There are all kinds of crimes that are punishable by death, but public execution is not done to punish somebody, it's to show what happens when you misbehave seriously. You would think that the elite was safe for these kind of repercussions, but the most famous case is already 9 years ago. That's the arrest and execution of the uncle or the uncle by marriage of the present-day leader. Purges are, and this is something which I'm not always happy with the way North Korea emerges in the media. But the one thing you always hear about is purges, right? Generals being blown to bits by cannon, for example. Or this man was supposed to have been eaten alive by a pack of hungry dogs who hadn't been fed for 3 days. As it turned out, and this made it even to The Guardian, as it turned out, this information came from a Chinese satirical Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter account. So somebody who pretends to be North Korean, who has the language down pat, and then this was picked up in the media afterwards, in international media. Anyway, my point here is that any dictatorship not only feeds on its people but also on its elite. It's the only way to make sure that you rule. If your elite, if you don't know who's going to be next in terms of purges. The international world, this is something which is often, especially on the conservative side of the political spectrum, I won't say exaggerated, but it's focused on. And this is one of those famous cases, abductees, young Japanese abducted by North Korea to teach Japanese to North Korean special services or to, and this is going to sound horribly insensitive, or to be put in a breeding program. I'll not go into those details. This did in fact happen. Kim Jong-un, so the father of the present-day leader, did apologize for this to the Japanese prime minister, but relationship hasn't been the same ever since he. I'll skip that. Ever since he admitted that this has happened. These are minor threats, however, and the thing I would like to draw your attention to is this. Now, I hope I have to. Oh no! Oh, we're not going to see the movie. That's a pity. Are we? It's a little further. Thank you. Okay. Well, there's another reason why I think we need to look at North Korea critically from an international point of view. But I'll keep that for you, because apparently, and I did it myself, I put in the movie later than I thought than I did. Let's revisit that in a few minutes or so. Then isolation. Well, I already briefly referred to that. It's not that difficult to go to North Korea, depending on your nationality. If you're there, is there anything? Well, of course, you'd have to go either as a diplomat or a tourist. And then what you can do there in terms of, for example, field research is limited, extremely limited. But to say North Korea is an isolated nation is not necessarily the case. If you would go to South Korea and you'd go to the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and you'll be looking at one of the most secure places in the world. There is almost no way to cross the border here between North and South Korea. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes you do hear news that either a North Korean soldier managed to make it to the south, usually riddled with bullets. And a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago, a North Korean who had defected from the north to the south through the border and then defected back again, and surviving both times. So it does happen, but it's really rare. So in that sense, you could say it's a very isolated country. But if you look at the other border with China, and now we get to the good bits, so don't leave. It's another case entirely. The border there is porous, to say the least, or used to be, because during the Corona period, it was impossible for North Koreans to leave the country, which led to another wave of people thinking that North Korea might collapse. And to be honest, I don't know. North Korea obviously didn't collapse, but it could have collapsed, because this border, its importance can hardly be overstated. North Korea used to be a socialist country. And one of the things of a socialist country is the agreement between states and its people that the state takes care of its people, right? In return for which the people, to the extent that they can, contribute to society, contribute to the state. North Korea lost this ability to feed its people. So when a big famine struck in the 90s, there was no more food. Those who survived, and 1 to 3 million people didn't survive, which is an incredible amount if you look at the population figures at that moment, about 22 million, learned how to cope. So they learned that it was no longer the state they could rely on. So who could you rely on? Yourself. And food needed to be brought in the country. So how do you get the food? You go to the north of the country. You cross into China, you buy the food with money that you've borrowed from friends, from relatives, or earned yourself. You go back, you sell it at the markets. And you get a bit more money, you invest it. Go back and do it again. This is the new, by the way, the new influential class in North Korea. Well, new, they've been there for 25 years or so. So if you close down that border, the people, the elite in Pyongyang will still eat. The regime takes care of that, but the average North Korean won't. So that border had been now it's open again. There's traffic again between China and North Korea and trade, but it was closed for a long time. Such a long time that we actually saw social disturbances in North Korea during the last year. But North Korea survived, as I said. But an isolated country, hardly. Let me skip this. Yeah. And isolated, also not isolated in another sense. And the fact that North Korea has been, and still is, and probably will be, a major exporter of products. I wouldn't be surprised if half of what we're wearing here was made in North Korea. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit. Okay, well, 1/3. I'm pretty sure that none of you is wearing a T-shirt or jeans that actually say "Made in the DPRK." But I'm equally sure that much of what we wear was probably made in China. If it was made in China, there's a good chance that it was made in North Korea or by North Koreans in China. I won't go into the details of that, but we've looked into the supply chains in some depth, and that was the conclusion, that much of the Chinese textile garment production that eventually ends up in the Netherlands or in Europe was actually outsourced to North Korea. There's another, more products are exported. The products you see here, so missiles, missile defense systems and the like, to mainly to countries in the Middle East and Africa. Why? Because North Korea offers you reliable and very cheap weaponry. Also, it's the only country in the world that still is able to repair and to upgrade old Soviet Union weapons. So if your country has an army that still uses Soviet Union era weaponry and you don't want to spend too much in upgrading it, your best bet is to go to North Korea because they know how to upgrade it, to repair it, and for a decent price also. And I think this is where the video comes in now. And this is a screenshot, and it's an older screenshot, but I tried to make a new screenshot today, and turned out my subscription to this database had lapsed, so I couldn't do it. It's a database of ships all over the world. And despite the sanctions, North Korean ships are still seen all across the world. Hardly isolated. Oh, here we are.
Stresses work day and night, and often
So this is part of a documentary on North Korea's overseas operations to... oh, this is the wrong moment. Sorry, that's me. I was not going to show you this. No. Oh. This is an interview with a North Korean who actually worked in the bureau that was responsible for earning money overseas. And that's done in very many different ways. You would be surprised. Maybe you can, I think I'm already very much behind time, so I'll won't explain this in detail. If you have any questions about this, it's an exceedingly interesting topic. But I would hardly call North Korea isolated in this sense. Anything but, to be honest. Oh, no, sorry. It stopped and I can't move on.
Have been destroyed. A tragedy. And
there we are. I think no. I'm not sure why it's not working anymore. Kan niet lezen met deze bril. Deze? Ja. Ah, there we are. Okay. Sorry, you might want to close your eyes while I flip through the slides because it's a bit dizzying. Two major takeaways as far as I'm concerned now here is that North Korea, well, it's a dictatorship and it's not isolated. And especially the way it reaches us through supply chains, basically through our own buying behavior, is surprising. But let's continue to the concentration camps. There's not very much I have to say about this. Because it's not the nicest topic. One of the reasons why the North Korean state is still functioning is because it can threaten with the most draconic kind of punishment. And the concentration camp system is one of the examples. There's another big reason why it still exists, I think, and I won't go into that today. It's the way society is structured and the way people meet and are supposed to be extremely transparent and open about their activities and what they think and everything. But the other reason is the camps, the fact that you can actually end up in a camp and disappear and not ever leave again. Not even your body will leave. Just at the beginning of this month, there was a so-called People's Tribunal, which is a slightly ironic title given the topic, North Korean crimes against humanity in the US. International Tribunal with North Korean refugees who were asked to testify about what went on there. It's still available on YouTube if you're interested. And this is one of the few times that the North Korean government actually came out to criticize an event like this, saying that it wasn't true. Okay, let's move on because I'm running behind time. If North Korea is in the news, it's usually about this, right? The army, the nuclear threat, the missiles. Well, let's take a look at the army. This is from a parade, military parade in 2017. It looks mighty impressive. North Korea has a very large standing army, about 2 million people, it is rumored, we don't really know, which is larger than the US. And which is the reason why North Korea always figures in scaremongers' lists of countries you have to do something about, whatever that means. But if you take a look at this army, you'll see that yes, it's undeniably large. It's also very much outdated, underfed, it's unmotivated, and it's usually used to build things. Most, if not all, of the construction projects done by the state, especially if they're complicated, done by the army, by soldiers. North Korean workers who are sent overseas to work, to earn money for their state, often they're also serving soldiers. And the average North Korean male serves for about 10 years in the army. So you can understand why the army is as large as it is. It's not the scariest army in the world. I would actually be more afraid of the South Korean army, which is the 6th army in the world. A bit smaller, but still 600,000 men. 500,000 to 600,000 men, and extremely well equipped. Missiles, let's take a look at those. Well, rapid development I wrote there, which is a bit of an understatement. I think we had 9 launches this year only. And then I wrote this a few days ago, and this is, well, you have to take victories where you can. One of the minor victories in life, ICBM test this morning. Probably the largest or the furthest traveling ICBM ever. Much more we cannot say at this moment. I'll get back to this at the end of this presentation, of this lecture, to place this into context. But missiles, yes, there is a reason why North Korea always makes the headlines there. And I would say that this is something to keep in mind. Also because they are being sold all through the world. Whenever you see, when you look, I don't know, CNN or Al Jazeera or another international news center, you see North Korean missiles being launched, you're basically looking at free advertisement for the North Korean arms program. Then, this is probably the biggest one, nuclear weapons. This is one of the statements for which North Korea is so famous. Our troops will fire our nuclear-armed rockets at the White House and the Pentagon in 2014, at which time they were not able to do so. Now they would be able to do so. It would also mean the end of North Korea, really. While I would be hesitant to say that we should not take North Korea seriously with regard to its nuclear threats. North Korea does possess nuclear weapons, you have to take them seriously. I don't think we should believe their threats necessarily, because any kind of launch of any kind of nuclear weapon would probably result in the destruction of North Korea. I'll skip that one. But there is a big but here, that the Ukraine invasion taught North Korea two things. One, never give up your nukes. And this is a lesson they learned over and over again. Libya gave up its nukes. What happened to Gaddafi? Ukraine gave up its nukes. What's happening now? So that's the first lesson, never give up your nukes. And the second lesson is an example. And maybe not the example you're thinking it is. Ukraine is not the example, Russia is the example. Think of what you can do with the threat of nuclear weapons hanging over you. So if North Korea is looking at anything at the moment, it's them looking at Russia and not at Ukraine. There is a threat there. There is always a threat with nuclear weapons. There's a bigger threat with a country whose leadership you don't fully know, which is the case in North Korea. But in case of a nuclear war, it won't happen that easily or that rapidly. The thing I'd be afraid of is a nuclear accident. What happens if something goes wrong in a nuclear reactor? Things do go wrong, right? They go wrong in Japan. And there are few countries in the world as advanced, technologically speaking, as Japan. What happened there? The entire world came and helped Japan. Can you imagine something like that happening in North Korea? Radiation leaking to China, to Russia, to South Korea, to Japan, to American troops on the Korean Peninsula. Everybody will want to help North Korea and stop that. Will North Korea say, yes, sure, we'll open our borders and come in and take a look at all our most dearly held secrets? Probably not. So what you then end up with is a possible very tense situation, maybe even an armed conflict, without any of the participants wanting this. So I'd be much more afraid of a nuclear accident than anything else. Okay. Then the last, I think, bit, and I'll go. Maybe I'll skip this because we talked about the concentration camps, and what I have to add here is, well, maybe I will not skip this because no, I'd like you to feel very guilty about the next part. It's our own complicity in North Korean crimes against humanity. It's very easy to look at North Korea and blame it for everything the regime does wrong, and you'd be completely right. This isn't the most pleasant regime in the world. North Korea developed into a country that in the 60s it didn't look like it would become, but it did. But we are complicit at the moment, really, because North Korean workers figure prominently in our own supply chains. So basically, we buy things built by North Koreans. We pay not the North Koreans themselves, which would be fine. If North Koreans want to come work in the EU, which they were able to before the sanctions until 2019, more power to them. If they could bring it home, but they couldn't. So they were being exploited, basically slaves, shopped around from country to country, building our ships, for example, building or putting together our clothes or shoes. We've published a few reports on this, made a few documentaries, and nothing ever changes. And that's important, I think, because this is not so much a danger to us. Well, it's a moral danger, but I'm not preaching here, so I'll shut up about that. But it is a danger to the people involved. If you hear their stories and the accidents that are associated with this kind of work, especially abroad, it's gruesome. And it's happening right here in our own European Union. It's a danger, of course, also to international standards and treaties. And it's a danger to decent work and fair pay, because there's no way you can compete with a slave. It's that simple. They'll always be cheaper, which is the reason they still exist. Entirely different lecture, but there are more slaves now than there ever have been in the history of humanity. Oh, and the North Korea. This is also the cause of Brexit. Well, I should say that with a bit of a wink. But once it was found out, and this is actually true, that European taxpayer money went into the hiring of North Koreans who were then exploited as slaves in Poland, the British newspapers had a field day. This was just the day or 2 days before Brexit. Anyway, don't take that too seriously. But this serves as maybe as a reminder that politics surrounding North Korea are never a thing to be underestimated. I'm almost nearing the 45-minute limit I set myself. A few things I'd like to discuss in the few minutes I've left. When Donald Trump came to office in the States, he did many things, and one of the things he also did was almost land us in a nuclear war with North Korea. I really thought that things would go wrong. One of the two parties would have to give way. In the end, it turned out Donald Trump gave way, and it blossomed into what he described as a love affair. He was in love with Kim Jong-Un, and Kim Jong-Un was in love with him. They wrote each other love letters, which is all fine and good. But given the fact that you're talking about two heads of state, you want a bit more than that. They met each other 3 times. They met in Singapore, they met in Hanoi, and they met in the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas. That's the middle picture. There was a declaration of intentions, but I thought I was looking at something else Donald Trump organized, a pageant in which you see the candidates come up to the microphone and say, well, what are your ambitions? My ambitions are world peace, end to hunger, everybody happy in the world. That was the level of the commitment made, and I'm afraid that after the 4 years or so that have passed since, if you look at what happened in North Korea, most notably Corona, which meant that for the first time in its history, the last 2 years have actually seen an isolated North Korea. Before, we never saw that. We've seen missile and satellite tests, and that satellite test, the test before the ICBM of this morning, 2 weeks ago or so, is worrisome because I'm told, and this is something I can't judge for myself, so I have to rely on the expertise of colleagues, is that what was tested was a mechanism to launch nuclear warheads, one at a time, but from one missile. We've seen Chinese dominance in the world increase, and we've seen the invasion of the Ukraine. And that's where we are today. So, this is where I see North Korea at the moment. Many things, I think, are very comparable to maybe 3 years ago when I gave another lecture here. It's still a dictatorship. It still has this system of concentration camps. It still pretends to be isolated, and we think it's isolated, but while in fact North Korea is present in, for example, our supply chains. It looks like it's communist, but really it's more capitalist country than most other countries. The big differences are that when I held the other lecture, the relationship with China was extremely difficult. Yes, China would never leave North Korea alone. It would not desert it. But it wasn't really happy with what was going on. It wasn't happy with the escalation with Donald Trump. We've seen meetings between the two heads of state, Kim Jong-Un and Xi Jinping. Sorry. And a much better, still a difficult, complicated relationship, but a much better relationship. The relationship with Russia, exactly the same. I think it was the Russian Minister of the Interior who said last week, after all the sanctions had once again been strengthened, the sanctions towards Russia, his literal words were, we need better and more integration with North Korea, whatever that may mean. So what you see now is worldwide, probably illiberalism is on the rise. Well, whether it's on the rise, I'm not sure. Maybe that's taking a too positive view of our past and how liberal we actually were. But I'm not entirely convinced that things are actually moving in the right direction. Let's put it like that. I'll skip this because I want to go to here. There we are. What you see, the immediate takeaway from the invasion of Ukraine, is that Russia is now heavily sanctioned. Not as heavily sanctioned as North Korea, but it is sanctioned. Where do you think that once the EU decides it will no longer buy Russian gas or oil, if that day comes, that oil and that gas will go? To a country, a neighbor of Russia, that has no access to a sufficient supply of oil and gas because it's been sanctioned. North Korea, I would say fertilizer. Again, if Russia cannot sell its fertilizer to South America, its biggest buyer at the moment, it will probably try to sell it to other countries, like North Korea. And if North Korea is really lucky, they'll be able to get it at a special discount. They used to get fertilizer, oil and gas during the heydays of North Korea in the 80s, 70s and 80s, when it was still part of a political bloc that stopped existing in 89 or thereabouts. So what you see is that North Korea has managed, against all odds and against all the predictions of people like me, North Korea has survived. And I really need to nuance and put this into context, but its system works. Not for the average North Korean, but it is a system that does not very easily stop working. The only conclusion is that the goals it sets, it realizes. And this is the important bit. With the polarization in the international world, the trade war between China and the US that is spawning into something else, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sanctioning of Russia and isolation of Russia in the international world, or part of the international world, means that North Korea once again finds itself with its former partners and friends. It's once again part of an international political bloc. Unfortunately, with partners who also ignore human rights, are inventive in controlling people, and ignore the UN and criticize democracy as weak and ineffectual. Now, while I'm reading this, I realize how completely outdated this sounds, and you're probably right. But the only reason for that is that I don't have any solutions. I can only tell you what I see. And what I see is that North Korea is back in a way it maybe has never been present on the international stage. So my guess is we'll hear a lot from North Korea the coming decade or so, but not exactly in the way we've heard about it before. No longer the isolated rogue state that everybody has a problem with, even its biggest friend China, but as part of a different way of doing things, whatever you think of that way. I think I'll stop here because I talked for about 50 minutes, and I'd very happily take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Remco. I first would like to go to the missile test of this morning. I read Reuters today, and I'm curious what we can expect since South Korea has a conservative administration coming in. Does this mean further escalation also with the missile test in back of the mind? Or as Reuters quoted the CEO of Korea Risk Group, are we going to face crisis-level tensions between the Koreas soon, causing another major, you could say, geopolitical headache for Biden? So kind of two fronts.
Well, if you look at it from a Korean peninsula point of view, it's going to be a very interesting time because we've had almost 5 years of a very liberal president for whom I think everybody had very high hopes when he entered office, but who hasn't been able to deliver with regard to North Korea. His policy of appeasement, rapprochement, understanding, has not brought a better relationship with the North. It did, however, avert war in 2017. I think if he hadn't intervened then behind the scenes, I don't know where we would have been now. But his subsequent policy didn't change the situation one iota. We're going to an even more an unknown really. Because the incoming president of North Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, was the head prosecutor, famous for his prosecutory efforts, and this is his first array into politics, and he immediately made it to the position of president. So I really don't know what to expect. He is more of a hardliner on North Korea than President Moon Jae-in, who is now still in office for another month or so, 2 months. but then most people are. And I would expect North Korea to test him. And what better moment than to test him before he can actually decide what to do and how to respond. And I think the South Korean government, because I mean everybody knows this, the South Korean army knows this better than anybody else, which is probably why they retaliated by firing their own ballistic missiles, just to show that they're ready for any kind of incident. But my guess is, yes, we'll see. If you look at it from a Korean point of view, we'll see increased tensions, but most probably manageable. But I know if somebody asked Kim Jong-Un very nicely to rack up tensions there to make it a very uncomfortable situation for the Americans, who all of a sudden have to look at Taiwan, increasing tensions, have to look at Ukraine, well, not increasing tensions, war, and have to look at the Korean Peninsula with increasing tensions, I would not be surprised. But not from a Korean point of view, that'd be the international geopolitical point of view, I think.
So that could be the influence of China, for example, or Russia.
Or Russia, or yeah.
And those are external threats, you could say. But you also mentioned in your talk the internal social rebellion, you could say, caused by the corona or the isolation and the lack of food or of the famine. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because in your presentation, you noticed how strict the regime is. You talked about the camps, the horror. It seems hard for me to think about a kind of social rebellion while... Yeah.
Well, now I can imagine, but you have to take into account also, and this is also, I think, something we don't always realize, the way people deal with each other. It's not like the average North Korean knows that you don't want to fall foul of the state because you will have a problem. But there are also people trying to make a living, and they know that they have certain rights. Also in North Korea, it's not like you don't have any rights. So if the state infringes upon those rights, the state will hear it. If a policeman does something which the average North Korean thinks shouldn't be done or can't be done, if it's not a very special situation, you'll hear it. And it's not like everybody's very obedient all the time. It's just you know that there's certain things you can't do. You have to be careful. But in general life, being a policeman or being somebody who works for the state doesn't exempt you from criticism or from fights with citizens. It happens all the time. Within a certain level, but they don't usually escalate into something else. And apparently that has been happening more often and on a wider scale than before. Where in one case the inhabitants of a village confronted the state and asked for, demanded redress when they felt treated unfairly. Not long, when was this, maybe 3 months ago, I think a woman who felt unfairly treated escalated this according to the North Korean system, but nobody ever uses it because you don't want trouble if you can avoid it, escalated a particular case in which she had been punished to the governor of the province, which you usually don't do. So there is, and I don't know how to be honest, I don't know enough about these cases to say more. I don't know whether this is because maybe paradoxically there's more freedom, so you feel more empowered and self-confident in doing this and dealing with the state, or maybe it's the opposite. There's so much despair that you don't care anymore. I have no idea. But we do know that there have been more disturbances. And one possible scenario would have been that in the absence of food, people would not stand for seeing their loved ones die like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. That apparently hasn't happened. So if it's not going to happen, and given the fact that the border between China and Korea seems to be as porous again as it was before, so food is entering the country, stability was regained, probably.
I'm looking at the audience. Are there questions or...
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture. So, Kim Jong-Un was educated in Switzerland, right? Does that impact his leadership style? Like, does that make his leadership style different from his dad or grandpa?
Not really. Visually, it does. Yes, he's a much more modern leader than his grandfather or his father were. We know, I mean, he brings his wife when he goes to certain events, which his father never used to do. He looks like he's more approachable. I doubt whether he really is. He seems more at ease with foreign leaders. When he was in Singapore, he was basically treated like a rock star by the people who saw him walk outside of the hotel. And people took selfies with him. Well, I think it was the Singapore Minister of Foreign Affairs, but so not random audience. But this is something which would have been unimaginable for Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung maybe, but different times. But in essence, no. It's exactly no. I actually would have a hard time in finding real fundamental differences, other than what the context and the times demands between Kim Jong-un and his father. And having been educated partly in Swiss, basically reinforced a very important point. This is what happens if you are a democracy, and I don't see anybody like me and like my family ruling the roost like we do back home. So if anything, it would have, I think, cured him of any notion to democratize and liberalize, because there's no room in a democracy for that kind of power. Well, actually, there is, of course, if you're Jeff Bezos, but no, let's not go there. No, but generally speaking, no. It would have probably told him the exact opposite of what was prophesied at the beginning. That this is somebody who we need to give a chance because he was educated in the West, so he'll do better. And I think there's a fair amount of Orientalist preconception also in what was in the analysis then. Things are fine here. He was here, so he'll do fine now. It's and it turned out that wasn't the case.
The previous president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, is known as someone who very adore North Korea, as a part of his family is still in North Korea. Do you see, is there a chance of reunion between North Korea and South Korea in the future?
That's a very good question, an urgent question, and a question I don't have any answer. I really don't know. Not in the near future. At least not one. Well, either South Korea would have to conquer the North, or the other way around, and then you'd have reunion. Then you could realize reunion very fast. I don't see that happening. What I would hope for is that North Korea turns into a neighbor you can deal with, which at the moment isn't the case. And then probably the problem is it's not just the difference in the political systems which make that difficult. It's the extreme difference in wealth. In South Korea has the 10th economy in the world now. It has the 6th largest army in the world. It's one of the richest countries in the world. If you look at the power of its culture, I mean, its soft power is humongous. Think of Hallyu, think of Squid Game, and then look at North Korea. So the differences between South Korea and North Korea are bigger than the then differences between West Germany and East Germany. And East Germany was poorer than West Germany, but never as poor as North Korea. Never. And so that's what, to me, seems like it's a big obstacle. Also, because if you would have the big companies follow their plans, I think, and that might be that was presented as an intermediate way of bringing the two societies into one fold. It's basically what we've seen over 10 years in Kaesong, right? The Kaesong industrial complex, in which you would have South Korean manufacturers in North Korea, South Korean capital, South Korean machinery, and North Korean labor in North Korea, paid according to North Korean standards, but now even a bit better, but very cheap for South Korea. And this was seen as the blueprint for eventual reunion. So you start with a kind of economical integration. But if you do that, what you basically do is you turn North Korea into a colony of the South. Because once you let go of the border, everybody will want to go to South Korea. And I can't blame them, because if I would be a North Korean, I would want to go to South Korea, where the wages are much higher. So what do you do? What do you need to do? You need to keep the border in place. You bring South Korean factories that are now based in Vietnam or in China or in the Philippines to North Korea. And you employ North Koreans who speak your language, who don't have unions. Well, that I can imagine it would be a very popular undertaking in the South Korean boardrooms. That would be possible. Would that be a good choice? I shudder at the thought, to be honest, because I think you'd recreate an old colonial situation. But it's heart-wrenching, also because the generation who still know that they have living relatives in the north is dying out. I mean, they're in the 80s and 90s. But I don't see any quick kind of unification. No.
Professor, I think they have some good relationship between China and North Korea. So what is the China's role behind the North Korea? Are China bringing some positive effect to North Korea?
That sounds like a very simple and good question, but it's a very complicated and good question. It depends on, you probably have to look at the very different ways in which China and North Korea interact, and they interact in many different ways. If you look at it economically, without North Korean access to Chinese markets and Chinese goods, North Koreans would find it very difficult to survive. So I'd call that a positive. I also think that China has tried to exercise, not always successfully, some influence on North Korea so that it would not behave too wildly towards its neighbor. Although at the same time, China also benefits, I think, from having North Korea in Northeast Asia, because you cannot not ignore it. You have to. You have to pay attention to it, and especially if for the United States that's a major headache. In terms of human rights, well, I wish there would be. I think that would be a negative if you see, and I don't know whether that's being followed up, but at a certain moment, North Korean ministers and vice ministers were in China to take a look at surveillance technology. Facial recognition technology and things like that. North Korea is a total surveillance state, but it's an analog total surveillance state. So the information gets written down still. I mean, it is written down and it's searchable. Well, in a way, it's not yet digitalized. And I would shudder really at the thought of digital North Korea. So in that sense, I would not say it's positive. But it depends. If you look at the way, again, the friendship, the real friendship between North Koreans who fought the Japanese guerrillas and Chinese guerrillas who fought the Kuomintang. There was that again is a very different way, and it's probably not on a state level, so maybe that's not what you mean, but there was a very strong relationship on that personal basis also between people in the two countries. Of course, we're in the third or fourth generation since, so I'm not sure whether that always still survives, although in the northeast, apparently it still does. But as you probably noticed, I can't really give you a very good answer on this, because the question is extremely large and complicated, and it really depends on what area you would look into and determine whether it's positive or negative. It can be both.
As we know about the relationship between China and North Korea, do you think is there any of the relationship between North Korea and Vietnam, which is also a socialist one-party country?
Yeah, well, good question. I think for a long time it was hoped that North Korea would go the path of Vietnam, which is also more than China, because China, I mean, you can try to be like China, but if you're not as big as China, it's going to be a very different kind of proposition. And North Korea just can't be like China. Vietnam is still much bigger than North Korea, but still it's a smaller country compared to China. It has its own troubled history. It used to be a divided country, in which, in this case, the North conquered the South, or defeated the South, which never happened on the Korean Peninsula. So I think for a very long time, people, also in South Korea, policymakers looked at Vietnam. And Vietnam diplomats actually did play a role in trying to bring North and South together. So it may be an example. At the moment, I'm not sure whether much energy is being expended, either by Vietnam itself or by South and North Korea with regard to Vietnam. But given the strong economic presence of South Korea in Vietnam, and Vietnam's, in many points, similar position to North Korea and similar background, it would make an excellent candidate to at least mediate. The problem is that I do think, and this complicates matters, or maybe it uncomplicates them, depending on how you look at it. I do think North Korea developed too long in the direction it has developed now for it to still bear structural similarity to a socialist country. I know what North Korea looks like, and it looks socialist, it was socialist, and it still retains parts of a socialist state. But in its roots, in its essence, it has turned capitalist, absolutist, and aristocratic. And I don't know anything about Vietnam, so maybe I shouldn't say anything about Vietnam, but I doubt whether that's the same in Vietnam. And this makes it so difficult to come to a conclusion, because no matter how you turn it, if North Korea is to engage in the international world in a more productive manner, so we say, the ruling family needs to sacrifice a lot, maybe even itself. And I don't see that happening. Other than that, yes, I would say that the Vietnamese example is something to take very seriously. Oh, maybe it's related to this. Another Southeast Asian country that was taken seriously as example by North Korea in the early 2000s is Thailand. Apparently Kim Jong-il, because he kept inviting Thai constitutional lawyers, apparently he was playing around with the notion that North Korea would become something like a constitutional monarchy. It would not be called a monarchy, I'm not sure what it would be called, in which his family would step away from daily actually running the country on a daily basis. So sacrifice much of his political power in return for a place in the constitution, like the Thai royal family in the Thai constitution, which means that they don't rule the country on a daily basis. The prime minister does that, the government does that, but they are invulnerable. You can't touch them, and they are absolutely necessary for the maintenance of the country. And maybe Kim Jong-il, because no matter what you think of him, the man was close to a genius in many aspects. Maybe he foresaw this kind of stalemate we're in now for North Korea. It's very difficult to find a way back, especially with all the indictments that will follow for the human rights abuses. And maybe that would have been an option. Step back, but retire in a way that also would have been acceptable to the Kim clan. Anyway.
Any other questions?
You said that it's difficult to ignore the country, but wouldn't it be best to just do that, to have a policy of not meddling in the country? Because Western influence in a lot of countries turned out really sour. So wouldn't it be the same in North Korea?
Oh, I fully agree there. And I would not propose doing anything in North Korea. And if North Korea is to be a different kind of country with a different kind of political system, a different kind of regime, that's up to North Koreans themselves. No, I completely agree with you. The last thing we should do is get in a tank with a flag saying freedom on it and invade the country. That's not going to help. Apart from the fact that it would probably actually trigger World War III, it would probably not help the North Koreans. It would flatten the country again. No, I fully agree there. The thing is, North Korea, as I hoped I explained, isn't isolated. So it is active in the international world in a way that does sometimes endanger not just national security, because that's often exaggerated when it comes to North Korea, except if you're South Korea, because then you have to live with a neighbor that's difficult to, not always easy to deal with. But for example, the presence of slave labor in supply chains is an issue I take very seriously, and that's an international issue. And North Korea plays a big role there. So maybe, but I do agree with you that we should not meddle in the country. That's up to North Koreans, it's their country. But the activities outside of North Korea, they're different. Other countries also get criticized or sanctioned or punished for their breaches of international law, and I realize that that's, especially at the moment, extremely arbitrary, and the bigger you are, the less likely it is you get punished for anything you do wrong. But still, I think it's not a bad idea to have those international norms and rules and notions and everything. And North Korea chooses to violate those. So there is that of North Korea. Other than that, I can only agree. If North Korea wants change, it's up to them. Yeah.
Maybe as a last question, also a little bit related to the norms. I think you started almost with your lecture that the Dutch are one of the biggest tourists in North Korea. Do you think, from a normative perspective, this is okay to go on holiday? Maybe there are people who like to visit North Korea, or should we also say, well, that should not be allowed?
And I have a very unnuanced opinion about this, I'm afraid. The thing is, what you hear is, well, if we go there, we can show people that Westerners are actually they're not all colonizing imperialists. We're also people. North Koreans know that, I think. Despite all the propaganda, North Koreans aren't stupid, and they know when they're being fed propaganda. And they've seen enough South Korean TV shows and everything to also know that people in different countries live differently. The thing is, they can't do anything with it. And if they see, for example, a Western diplomat bowing to the statue of Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung, what it tells them, and this isn't my analysis, this is what I got from North Koreans themselves, is basically what it says to them, well, if they can't avoid doing it, there's no way we can avoid it. So there's that. There's the relatively minor matter of funding a regime that doesn't, that is a really bad human rights offender, but it's not, well, the money, I mean, it's not extremely, it's not very much. But I'd be, no, I'd be definitely not in favor. To me, it would feel like visiting Berlin in 1939. Great people, Germans. Like North Koreans are great people, but there is something wrong with the political system. And you don't want to be seen as endorsing that, I think. And there has been a transitionary period, I think, in which North Korea still looked like it was socialist, until where we are now, in which, well, it still looks like it's socialist, but it really isn't, and hasn't been for at least 20, 25 years. So that, I think, is also gone. The old sympathy that you might have for one of the last remaining socialist countries in the world. Well, socialism in North Korea died a long time ago. And if you put that all together, I'd say no, don't go.
Thank you. May we invite you back in 4 years again? I mean, you said North Korea is back, so
Yeah.
I hope we can
Well, now
invite
that
you back.
I intimated that North Korea will then still exist, you'll probably see that it won't. But no, yes, I'd be very happy.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for attending, although it's very nice weather, but I hope you can still have a beer on the terrace. And I would like to ask one more round of applause for...